Back when the Nodcry teaser came out, the thing that I really latched onto for some reason was the fact that Flins' blue flames reminded me of how Dainsleif's nondescript element appears. So I immediately went and wrote a theory about Dainsleif using powers from the moon. It was something that I had already been considering after Mavuika introduced us to this concept of Nodcry's people wielding a mysterious power that predates elemental energy. Thanks to that whole idea, plus Long Night's Oath containing lore about Flins' faction, the Lightkeepers, I felt like I had just enough to work with for some broad speculation at least. Now that Flins' lore is available, we know about Kuuvahki, and most importantly, Dainsleif was able to help Columbina keep the Moon Gate open. There's a lot more to work with here now, so I think it's time to revisit this. Admittedly, when it comes to the Moon Gate, it could just be that you need the power of one of the moons in order to get it open. Then at that point, it just needs to be fed enough energy in order to stay open. However, Tholindis does mention that there's a rather specific type of energy needed to open it, something that they are hiding from us because it's redacted. How dare you? Why won't you give me the knowledge? So, based on this, let's assume, for the sake of the theory, that Dain's compatibility with this task goes beyond just being able to feed a ton of mana into the expensive portal spell. The idea of Dainsleif using moon-based powers has definitely been one of my hot takes, especially at the time I first started going on about it. The moons still count as goddesses after all, and there's a lot of doubt surrounding the idea of an Eclipse Dynasty khaenri'ah having any willingness to use the power of a type of god or goddess. However, I think that khaenri'ah atheism is primarily directed towards gods of Celestia, and the moons would be regarded in a different way because they are more dragon-associated since they were created by Nibelung. There is a good example during We Will Be Reunited, because Dain implied that his main issue with Boreas was cooperation with the Animo Archon, and not with Boreas himself or wherever the wolf god's power originates from. Moonlit Bamboo Forest states that the wolf packs are children of the moons. So, the moons are probably the original source of Boreas' power. I really think Dain's hatred towards gods is aimed at Celestia and those who answer to the heavenly principles. Although I am also pretty sure that Dain's situation is related to some kind of curse, much like Arlecchino's Balemoon Bloodfire, but we'll get into that later. I know a lot of people think that Dain uses the same chaos permeation as Skirk and Sertology, but Skirk's character story about the Seven Shifting Serpent has always made me feel otherwise. There actually seems to be a lot of misunderstandings regarding chaos permeation and what it was commonly used for. The underlying principle was analogous to using the abyss to permeate reality, creating specific forms of negative pressure to thereby call upon the flow of a corresponding element's energy. To khaenri'ah, chaos permeation was a mere party trick employed in performances and parades. As a warrior, the Fowl knew nothing of this technique at first, but as his understanding of abyssal power deepened, he came to master it almost instantly. While ordinary performers could spend months practicing the shifting of a single element just to scrape by as street entertainers, the Fowl was able to effortlessly cycle through all 7 on his first attempt. I feel like this story makes it quite clear that Sertology and Skirk's level of mastery when it comes to this technique is almost unheard of, and most people weren't using it as anything more than a performance trick. Consider that in context with how Dainsleif describes abyssal power and khaenri'ah technology as cheap tricks that he is all too familiar with during Requiem of Echoing Depths. He also has another line of dialogue where he refers to abyssal power as a cheap trick when you are able to summon him during a space and time for you. When he is saying that, he is probably talking about this chaos permeation technique. He seems to view abyssal power and chaos permeation as a crude and cheap way of channeling power, and I really do not think he is using this. Due to its location along the roots of Irminsul, khaenri'ah lived in close proximity to the Abyss, and they had a closer relationship with it than the surface realms, but high-level exploitation of abyssal power was not the norm in terms of your average khaenri'an citizen. This is something Capitano mentioned during Act 5 of Natlan's Archon quests.
カーン類野人は重罪を犯し、そして呪いをかけられた。愛する者の消滅を見届け、肉体の果てなき苦痛を味わえという目的でな。だが、その中には無実の人の方が多い。五大罪人がアビスの力を利用したことすら知らないのだ。俺もその一人だった。
Rotvangi, the mad monk later known by Rotwang, was expelled from the Universitas Magistorum for delving too deep into forbidden knowledge. King Irmin's obsession with abyssal power was a subject of controversy, and he even earned the title of Vinster King because this obsession drove the nation towards its destruction. So I'm hoping we are all on the same page now in terms of this fact that khaenri'ah was not just a nation full of personalities like Irmin, Rotwang, and the sinners who were a little bit too tempted by the forbidden fruit. Something else I pointed out last time had to do with the way our summonable Dainsleif interacted with the abyssal pylons. When users of visions or other types of elemental energy clear out abyssal corruption, they repel it with the power of the light realm, while someone compatible with the abyss, like Traveler and Skirk, tends to absorb it. Our ability is not cleansing the abyss, it is absorbing it. When we cleanse the abyss, it is flowing into us. Skirk places her abyssal pylons during combat, and then she absorbs them for a buff. So, the way that Dain was blasting the abyssal shields on the pylons away looked, to me, more like the process of repelling the abyss with some sort of light realm-based power. It would have to be something that predates Celestia to align with Dain's principles, since khaenri'ah has lived alongside this crimson moon which turned into a dark sun. It seemed probable to me that Dain could be using this unique power sourced from the moons that we had heard about from Mavuika and Helka. So originally, I suggested that maybe Dain isn't using the power of the Abyss at all, and that perhaps his line in the Travail teaser about defying fate with a power from beyond this world is referencing the external variable brought about by Descenders, rather than the power of the Abyss itself. There was a pretty good suggestion made by someone in the comments last time that I'd like to bring up here, that maybe Dain's ability is sourced from both the Light Realm and the Abyss in a way. Maybe the shadows are the Abyss and the blue fiery parts are sourced from a pre-celestial Light Realm power like Kuuvahki. However, the lore from the Bakunawa quest introduced an alternative idea to this equation because of this transcendent power of the Abyss mentioned in Enjo's notes. Bakunawa's immortality doesn't stem from the power of life, like Rhindaughter's other creations, but instead comes from some sort of transcendental abyssal power that even the Abyss Order doesn't understand. And I'll tell you what I think is going on here in terms of the transcendent abyss. I think that the transcendent abyss is supposed to be imaginary energy, which gets into lore from the Honkai games, the Sea of Quanta, and the Imaginary Tree. The Sea of Quanta is described as the space in between worlds, and it represents chaos or disorder. From the Sea of Quanta came the Imaginary Tree, which represents order. The Abyss and Irminsul are literally a microcosm of this, as Irminsul's roots grow into the Abyss, from which the World Tree creates order out of the chaos. The chaotic purple abyss is the Sea of Quanta, while the blue abyss that's been refined by Irminsul represents imaginary. This is why Dainsleif's element is repelling the abyss more like the way an elemental energy user would, because quantum and imaginary are still opposing forces. They are two sides of the same coin, but still tend to be at odds with each other. Perhaps the reason that Enjo has vaguely categorized this energy as a type of transcendental abyssal power is because they're ultimately made of the same stuff, and he simply doesn't know enough about the imaginary to give it its own name and category. If the blue energy is supposed to be imaginary, which is being treated like a transcendent form of abyssal power, this would probably mean that maybe, technically, the blue Irminsul energy and the crystal in the divine nails probably count as a type of abyssal power. It's how the abyss appears when it's been sorted into a more orderly form to be compatible with the world. Since, as I said, Irminsul is essentially a microcosm of the imaginary tree, this actually makes a lot of sense. And if you are confused, like, no, that doesn't make sense because the abyss is supposed to be a power from beyond this world, so how could the literal world tree be a power from beyond? Well, I don't think Irminsul has always been there. Remember how A told us that the sacred sakura hadn't always been there, and it only appeared after she returned from khaenri'ah 500 years ago? We planted it from within Makoto's realm of consciousness, and then the tree appeared way in the past as if it had always been there. There's also that entry from Before Sun and Moon that talks about this type of phenomena, the parable of the tree. So I think that there might be a sacred sakura type situation going on with Irminsul as well. This book, The Legend of the Shattered Halberd, has an interesting mention pertaining to Irminsul. The book seems to contain Gnosis lore hidden under a layer of fiction. It talks about these divine halberds, meteorites that fell from the sky, and how one of them was carved up into these ominous swords. So that very much seems to be referencing the third descender and his fate of being turned into these Gnosis. Towards the end of the book, it states, the first divine halberd, Irmin, once pierced the axis mundi and connected the 9 worlds. Now its replicas had proliferated across the heavens. So if the divine halberds are supposed to reference these beings that come from beyond the sky and can surpass the gods, then this has strong implications that Irminsul also comes from beyond this world. I know Ashikai has speculated in past videos that Irminsul could be one of the void shuttles mentioned in the description for Calamity of Aeshu's refinement material, Shuttle of Odara. The mighty dragons who then roamed the Soulfire plains had a word for a construct that traversed the pitch-black darkness between the stars. In their long-forgotten language, they called such creations void shuttles, blazing javelins that could pierce through anything, even a veil thick enough to shroud an entire world. I'd also like to mention that, in the Paths space within the Star Rail universe, the big spiral at the center has a blue energy flowing through it that is similar to the blue Irminsul glow, and the paths are connected to imaginary energy. So, operating on this assumption, Dain's element would be imaginary. Given what they did with Skirk and her cryo that isn't cryo, there's a possibility they do something similar with future characters. However, we still have the rest of Nodcry and all of Snezhnaya before the khaenri'ah chapter is here, so maybe by then they will be ready to introduce a new element. Either way, just know that from here on out, whenever I talk about the transcendent abyss, we are just kind of assuming that it's a type of imaginary energy. Enjo notes that bizarre time distortions appear around historical mentions of the Marejaveri, and speculates that this transcendent power of the abyss bears some sort of connection to time. Venti gives us even more context on this when he tells us that the Marejaveri's corruption is inherently attached to the concept of time, so he blew it off the timeline, creating the Windless Land. And according to Enjo, Bakunawa's unique immortality probably stems from this same corruption of time. Bakunawa definitely holds some sort of space in all the recent moon lore, given that, in mythology, Bakunawa are moon-eating dragons. I do think that this all might have something to do with that information being redacted from us during Thelindis' studies on the Moon Gate. I think that the specific power source required to open the gate is the same as this transcendent power of the abyss that Enjo was studying in relation to Bakunawa. I mean, remember how Rayrir described being tossed into the swirling chaos of time?
かつての俺は幾千万もの破片に分解され、混沌とした時間の中に投げ込まれた。それでも、俺の命と意志が消えることはなかった。
The Moon Gate is some sort of spatial portal, and the concepts of space and time are intrinsically connected. Consider how the time tunnels in the game don't really transport us through time, they transport us through space. Also, Bakunawa's belly almost seems like a portal to somewhere, like Gluttony from Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Gluttony was supposed to be Father's failed attempt at creating a gate of truth, so I wonder if Bakunawa was Reindotter's failed attempt at creating something like the Moon Gate. Honestly, this is something I've really been thinking about a lot because Gluttony works as such a good comparison considering that the Bakunawa is also known as an eater, a devourer. The Gate of Truth appears as an eye, and that Song of the Welkin moon symbol that shows all of the moons in a syzygy looks a lot like an eye. Rerir even has those eyes on his palms after he makes his return, which he did not have before entering the Moon Gate. The Abyss turned his eyes pink and his hair white, but he did not have these hand eyeballs until after his return. Also, when he brute forced his way out of his imprisonment within Thoth's chess set, this portal that he came out of looks like a freaking eye. In light of all of this, I've been having this deep suspicion that Kuuvahki might come from the imaginary. That Colors Out of Space quest from Nodcry really makes me feel like Kuuvahki might be originally sourced from the Abyss. Somehow. I know that doesn't make much sense considering how Kuuvahki comes from the Light Realm, which should be at odds with the Abyss, but there are signs of Kuuvahki's association to the Abyss. The Color Out of Space is the name of a short story by H.P. Lovecraft, and Lovecraftian references are used for themes and concepts related to the Abyss. In this short story, a meteorite falls to Earth and brings with it globules that contain mysterious colors which lie outside the visible spectrum. The colors drive people mad, mutate and kill off the livestock, and suck the life out of the vegetation until eventually there's nothing left but acres of gray land. It all goes rather well with the Abyss coming from beyond the skies, and how it is a force that seems to strip the color from things. During the Colors Out of Space world quest, Traveler gets pulled through this portal that looks a lot like a moon gate, and we float through this strange abyss purple space before we re-emerge in the same area as before. The rock's surface has been completely smoothed over and is now bathed in this pure white watery light with Kuuvahki patterns on it. I think this all very much comes back to some of the connections I've already been drawing between the concept of the moon's reflection and lore surrounding the paths of remembrance and enigmata from Honkai Star Rail. The realm associated with the Aeon of Remembrance is described as an area devoid of shape and color, surrounded by floating memories and uncatchable memory bubbles. Within this realm, Mythos the Enigmata, an Aeon with a propensity for erasing information, supposedly manifests in the world's reflection. So themes of devoidness of shape and color, along with the moon's reflection, really seem to align here. The Enigmata can also be analogized so well to Arlecchino's Balemoon Bloodfire that erases memories. My entire last video was on this topic if you'd like additional context. So, with all that being said, I'm not so sure if this place from the Colors Out of Space quest has been corrupted by the Abyss, or if we are just looking at the raw chaotic data that fate is woven from. This could explain some of the peculiar things we have seen regarding Kuuvahki, like how despite the fact it is a power of the Light Realm and should be at odds with the Abyss, Rerir was able to absorb Kuuvahki to gain strength. We even Uno reverse carded him on that process during the fight.
力を盗んで俺を倒すつもりか。
そっちも空爆を盗んだでしょ。
During that cutscene, they literally showed us the abyssal power that we were stealing from Rerir being transmuted into these golden threads of fate. In Skirk's animated short, there's a scene of her training in the abyss where you can see this red and blue aura on the horizon that is rather reminiscent of Kuuvahki. I have similar thoughts about the primordial sea feeling rather abyssal in nature, due to how the hydro element and the abyss both engage in mimicry. Moons and seas even have an existing connection to each other through the tides. So, to move on from that tangent, it could very much be that this transcendent power of the Abyss is what Dain sources his ability from. And if that redacted information is referring to the same type of energy, this is probably why Dain was able to help Columbina keep the Moongate open. In contrast to those cheap tricks employed by others, Dain is using a power of the Abyss that is less crude and goes beyond their understanding. Based on the fact that Bakunawa's boss subtitle is Permeated Body, it seems like it could operate on similar principles to chaos permeation, but is ultimately a higher level technique because he's drawing upon a power source that is less understood. A relation to time makes sense for Dain because he has a lot of connections to time. He's described as the confluence between the past and the future. His brother, Vedrfolnir, has long since carried the gift of foresight and would eventually become the sinner occupying the Blasphemy Against Time title. Dainsleif has the ring given to him by Ved that has allowed him to retain his form despite the gruesome nature of the immortality curse, because the ring constantly rewinds time on his body. Plus, whatever power Dain uses manifests as blue, and with Hoyo's color theory, blue typically means memories and time. Considering the title of Bowkeeper and his extensive knowledge of so many characters displayed in video narrations, Dain's connection to Irminsul and the memories contained in it seems obvious. I'm always talking about how he's got that blue Irminsul glow to him as well. Irminsul contains the preordained fate enforced upon the world by the usurper, while the moons were created to guide fate in Nibelung's stead, so they play a similar role in terms of weaving fate. There's also those Irminsul-adjacent silvery moon trees that grow all over Hisi Island. Also, these strange patterns you can find on the ground around Hisi remind me of the bark of a tree. The best way that I can possibly summarize how I view Dainsleif's ability is that his mysterious blue conjurations and Arlecchino's Balemoon Bloodfire are two sides of the same coin. Arlecchino's flames burn away memories, while Dainsleif is a keeper of memories. They also very much look like red and blue versions of the same sort of power, which is interesting considering Kuuvahki's charges appear as red and blue. With Arlecchino, we know her curse comes from the iridescent moon which fused with the Abyss to prolong its life. Her boss description seems to mention the source of the curse being a poison that her ancestors imbibed in, and that poison was probably concocted from Abyss-tainted moon god remains. Dain might also have some sort of curse, which feels especially hinted at with one dialogue from Act 4.
もし月の狩人があれほどのアビスの力を持っていなければ、おそらく引き裂かれた瞬間に死んでいただろうね。でもアビスの力は呪いのように。
その通りだ。アビスの力は確かに呪いと言える。
Maybe his curse is connected to the dark sun that eclipsed the crimson moon. And if Arlecchino got her Balemoon Bloodfire from ancestors imbibing god remains, and Bakunawa got its abilities from moon eating... No, Dain, not you too. Why are we always eating the gods? I'd also like to take another look at Flins, since his blue flames were the big inspiration for my first attempt at this idea. We now know that Flins is one of the Snowland Fae, and his third character story tells us that his original form was that of a blue flame that guided fallen souls across the icy plains. So, Flins is just like one of those blue wisps that you can find around Wuwang Hill, and his original job was guiding souls to the far shore. He's based on the will-o'-the-wisps from various types of folklore, and he's probably Electro despite his blue flames because of the electromagnetic frequencies believed to be given off by ghostly activity. Venti is also a character whose original form was that of some sort of wisp, and Venti does have the ability to ferry souls. I find this all rather interesting since Venti already came up earlier due to his connections to time. In Flins' voiceover about his moon wheel, he mentions that he doesn't really need it because the Fae have their own methods, but it still serves as a convenient cover for the power that he wields. Based on the finale of the Deep Galleries lore, it seems like Fae spirits are forged from moonlight. So I'm assuming his latent abilities are also tied to the moons in one way or another. So maybe the methods the Fae have are also sourced from the transcendent abyss. By far my favorite piece of evidence when it comes to the idea of Dain sourcing powers from the moon comes down to the Frost Moon Scions. The Frost Moon Scions are given deer-like traits, right? And in Norse mythology, Dain is one of the names for the deer that live near the cosmos tree Yggdrasil. So, one of Dain's namesakes within mythology is literally a deer, truly an honorary Frost Moon Scion. That's his Deersona. Anyway, so I am now leaning towards this idea that Arlecchino and Dain's abilities are meant to be a sort of contrasting power that are each sourced from some sort of curse. And I think that the imaginary is probably involved here. If Arlecchino's curse that erases memories represents defying fate through the power of oblivion, then Dain's curse represents the attempt to rewrite fate through new memories. They are the process of unmaking and remaking. Though Inversion of Genesis taught us that the past is not so easily changed, for a broken vase is still a broken vase regardless of how it broke. But the future and its infinite possibilities could save us all, so long as you can find a way to defy the fate preordained by the stars. I definitely never meant to go a full month without uploading anything because I'm trying to be more consistent, but I got so caught between multiple scripts, and I also got a bit lost in the sauce on a research tangent. I was like, I need to refresh on more old lore I might have forgotten, and read more mythology. I must learn, I must find forbidden knowledge. So, if you made it all the way here to the end, I definitely appreciate it, as this project was a hell of a process. Please consider subscribing if you aren't already subscribed, leave a like and a comment as those really help push videos into the algorithm. Check out my Patreon if you're interested in small, optional support. And hopefully I'll see you next time.